So this doctor, he has one goal. He wants to be rich. Let's call him Dr. F. And Dr. F's an oncologist, he specializes in treating cancer, and he's well respected, but he's not rich. And in order to get rich, one day he figures out this scheme. His scheme is that when his patients come in, he starts diagnosing them with cancer, whether they have it or not. He's like, oh, sorry, you have cancer. He then submits that info to the patient's insurance company, and the insurance company then pays him for giving the patient very expensive cancer treatment. Here's the biggest problem with that. Other than the fraud. Not only does the patient falsely believe that they're dying, but they also have to actually go through that treatment. So then you've got a completely healthy person going through chemo, and chemo can fuck you up. But Dr. F, he doesn't care. He's gonna be rich. And to his credit, his scheme works. Suddenly he's getting paid left and right. He starts telling more and more of his patients that they have cancer, and then they all start seeking treatment. So he gets even more money, and then he buys a 6,000 square foot house, and he expands his businesses. Now he has 7 locations. And then 6 years go by, and he's still running this scheme, and it is still successful. And at this point, he's convinced hundreds of his patients that they have cancer when they don't, and then he's pumping them full of chemo drugs, and he's pocketing the insurance money. And business is booming, and finally, bam, Dr. F has met his goal. He's finally rich. Until one day, this woman, Monica, she comes in to see Dr. F for something. And of course, Dr. F immediately diagnoses her with cancer when she doesn't have it. And he tells her she needs to start treatment right away. So Monica starts treatment, and after her first day of chemo, she feels like absolute shit. In fact, she feels so bad that when she goes home, she trips and falls and breaks her leg pretty badly in 2 different places. So she goes to the clinic where she would normally see Dr. F. But this time, Dr. F isn't there. He's out of town on vacation. So another doctor's there making rounds in F's place. This doctor, Dr. So. So So looks at Monica's leg, and he also starts examining the rest of her. And pretty quickly, he's like, this woman doesn't have cancer. And later, he breaks the good news to her. She's not dying. She doesn't need chemo. And he advises her to never see Dr. F again. And that whole interaction makes Dr. So suspicious. And he starts investigating, and he starts digging into all the patient's records, looking for more evidence that Dr. F is misdiagnosing people. Now, around that time, Dr. So is at the clinic having a conversation with this guy, George. George is the office manager there. And George is like, hey, Dr. So, I heard you're quitting. And So's like, yeah, I'm quitting. There's some shady stuff going on around here. So then George gets suspicious, and he starts investigating. He's checking records, he's interviewing staff, and he gathers tons of evidence. And once he looks at it all and realizes what's actually going on, he takes all this evidence to the FBI. The FBI gets the Medicare Fraud Strike Force involved. Yes, that's a real thing. And then they look into this, and they find that over the course of 6 years, Dr. F had committed $34 million in Medicare and health insurance fraud by convincing 553 people that they have cancer. So they immediately raid Dr. F's clinic and they arrest him, and he's charged with all kinds of stuff, and he gets sentenced to 45 years in prison, and he has to pay a bunch of the money back. And all this happened in Michigan, so shout out to Michigan. This guy, let's call him Chuck. And Chuck is about to become one of the most prolific serial killers in US history. So Chuck, he's a nurse, and one day he's at work, working at a hospital, and he looks down at a patient, and the patient is crying in pain. So Chuck looks at him, and Chuck is like, I really want to help this guy by putting him out of his misery. So then Chuck secretly injects the guy with a bunch of lidocaine. And the guy passes away. And I guess afterwards, Chuck feels pretty good about himself because he does it again and again and again. He'll like sneak into their room and he'll secretly spike their IV drips with insulin. And then of course the patients will pass away. And he does this for a while. And over time, the hospital starts to wonder, why are so many patients overdosing on insulin? And Chuck is the nurse in charge of most of those patients. So he immediately becomes a prime suspect. But unfortunately, the hospital can't quite prove that Chuck intentionally unalived anyone, so they allow him to resign. And then a month later, Chuck takes a new job at a different hospital. There, he slips 3 elderly women a heart medication they don't need, called digoxin. The digoxin, of course, kills them. Then about a year later, he's working at another hospital. And there, same thing. He unalives a 91-year-old woman with digoxin. Then he gets a job at a rehab center. And there, one night, he sneaks into a patient's room while they're sleeping. And he's got a syringe, and he's about to unalive them. But luckily, the patient wakes up and fights back. And apparently, there's some kind of struggle, and it ends with the patient having a broken arm. And so yeah, of course, then the rehab center fires Chuck. Oh, but Chuck, he just keeps on going. He again gets a new job at a new hospital, and there he unalives another patient with digoxin. Then he leaves that hospital and does the same thing at a new hospital. Then yet again at a different new hospital, he unalived 5 more people. So at this point, Chuck's been secretly unaliving people off and on for about 14 years. And no one has ever really caught him because no one can prove he's the one who's doing it. Until one day, Chuck gets a job at a new medical center, and there he meets an ICU nurse. Her name's Amy, and Amy likes Chuck. She thinks he's a good nurse who has a lot of knowledge about medicine, so quickly Chuck and Amy become work friends. They talk all the time at work, he really opens up to her, but secretly, on the side, Chuck is still murdering his patients. Then, one day, an assistant pharmacist working at the hospital pharmacy, they notice a suspiciously high amount of deaths in one ward, and the deaths are all due to overdoses of insulin and digoxin. And police, they start looking into these deaths and they start connecting the dots, and all roads are pointing to Chuck being the one responsible. So the hospital immediately fires him, which sucks for Chuck, but police realize Chuck can just go get a new job at a different hospital, and police want to stop that from happening. They want to charge him with murder, but first, they have to find proof. So they go to Chuck's friend, Amy, and they tell her everything. Everything Chuck's been doing, he's been unaliving patients, they show her all the proof they have, and Amy is shocked. I mean, this is her friend. So police ask her if she'll help them bust Chuck. She'll wear a wire and she can go meet up with him and see if she can get him to confess. And it's a tough decision, I'm sure, but Amy ultimately agrees. So she wears the wire, and then she hits up Chuck and she asks him to meet her at a restaurant. So then Chuck comes to the restaurant to meet her, and they're talking. And Amy's clever. Once she gets him talking, she gets him to admit everything he's done. All the unalivings, all the patients, exactly how he did it, everything. And she records the whole thing. So finally, after a 16-year spree, Chuck is finally arrested. Here's his mugshot. And when all is said and done, he admits to unaliving around 45 patients total. Although in retrospect, they actually think it might be closer to 300. But they can't really prove it due to lack of records. Regardless, Chuck goes to trial, he's found guilty, and he's sentenced to 11 different life sentences, like over 400 years in prison. I don't think he's getting out. So this guy, his name's George, and George has a big problem. The SWAT team has got him surrounded, and it doesn't look like he's giving up anytime soon. So this all started because George has a 27-year-old son who we'll call Trip. And George and Trip are really close. But one day, everything changes, because even though Trip is only 27 years old, he has a massive stroke. So they rush him to the hospital, and while he's there, doctors do everything they can to save him. But unfortunately, he ends up in a coma, and now he's on life support. So George is there with Trip's mom, who we'll call Mom, and Trip's brother, who we'll call Brother, and they're all in Trip's hospital waiting room waiting for an update. But see, this is not their first time in a situation like this with Trip, because he's had seizures and stuff like that in the past, and even when it feels like he's not gonna make it, Trip always pulls through. Regardless, this time the doctors come in and they got some bad news. They tell Trip's family they've done everything they can, but unfortunately, Trip is brain dead. And they basically tell the family it's probably time to take him off life support. And the family is just torn up by this news. And Mom, with tears in her eyes, she agrees. But George is like, wait a minute, no way. Why are we being rushed into this? But Brother and Mom disagree. There is nothing that can be done. And they give the hospital permission to start taking him off life support. And George, here's the thing about George. George has been drinking, like, a lot. So he's a little more emotional than usual. And doctors assure him that Trip has no brain activity. And George is like, no, we've gone through similar things like this before. He's had seizures and stuff in the past, but he's always pulled through. Just freaking listen to me. And this escalates, and it escalates, and soon George is yelling at the doctors, he's yelling at the nurses. He says that if they'll just give him a few more hours, he'll be able to process all this and decide if it's really time to pull the plug or not. But no matter what he does, no one is listening to him. The hospital is moving forward, and there's nothing George can do. Until suddenly, out of nowhere, George pulls out a pew-pew and he points it at the doctors and he tells them to back away from his son. And naturally, everyone starts freaking out. Like, whoa, calm down, buddy. And one of the nurses calls 911.
Hey, we need the police stat to the hospital. We have a family member with a gun.
So George is there, drunk, waving his pew-pew around, threatening to unalive the staff. But then, out of nowhere, boom. Brother jumps on him, and they wrestle, and he manages to take the pew-pew out of his hand. But George is far from done. He looks at the whole room and he's like, you think that's the only weapon I got? So everyone is like, okay, I don't get paid enough for this. And they all leave the room. And George immediately shuts the curtain around Tripp's bed so no one can see what's going on. Then, because the nurse called 911, the SWAT team shows up. And they put the entire hospital in total lockdown. And they don't want this to get ugly, so they're basically like, George, please surrender. And George is like, nah. And the whole time, he's by Tripp's side holding his hand. And this standoff goes on for hours, with the SWAT team just outside waiting because they don't want George to go crazy with whatever second weapon he has. Here's the thing though, George doesn't have a second weapon. He never had a second weapon. He just told everyone he did so he could buy Tripp some more time. So they've been in this standoff for about 3 hours, and then suddenly, Tripp squeezes George's hand. And George is like, whoa! He's not sure if he imagined it, so he tells his son to squeeze it again, and Tripp does. And as you can imagine, George is overjoyed, like maybe Tripp isn't brain dead. In fact, George is so happy, he immediately surrenders. And police arrest him, and here's his mugshot. So then George goes to trial, and he spends 11 months in prison. But here's the best part. Tripp eventually wakes up, and he makes a full recovery. Last I read, he's fine now. He even went on TV and did an interview and talked about it.
There was a law broken, but it was broken for all the right reasons. I'm here now because of it.
And all this happened in Tomball, Texas, so shout out to Texas.